Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. These webinars are offered by GG&A to help our clients and others learn to respond to the fundraising challenges we face due to the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Eric Snook. I'm a vice president at GG&A. One quick housekeeping note: due to time constraints today, we'll not be taking your questions live. Please do, though, use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and we will answer them over the next few days. I am very excited to welcome our guest today, Joe McKenna. Joe is the president and CEO of Sarasota Orchestra, but like all the best CEOs, he's very hands-on in the orchestra's advancement work. And I should tell you that he's coming to you from the northern fringes of Hurricane Eta, where it's raining and storming and pouring. So it's not as though the pandemic doesn't give us enough challenges this year. We got a little weather to mix in as well. The Sarasota Orchestra is really a bright, shining light in the city's cultural scene for many reasons, most especially, though, because they surpassed their fundraising goal last spring, despite having to shorten the performance season due to the pandemic. And then they turned right around and raised enough money to support a Reimagined season, one that keeps the orchestra vibrant and present in the community, but without significant revenue from ticket sales. I think we all understand that presenting organizations, museums, orchestras, others that rely on ticket revenue, these are organizations that are having a really hard time with the pandemic. So we thought it'd be very interesting and informative to talk with Joe about how the Sarasota Orchestra has managed. Joe, great to have you here.
Nice to be here, Eric.
So let's set the stage a little bit. As I said, your official title is president and CEO. But I know you also sort of function as the Chief Development Officer as well. So maybe give us a quick overview of the orchestra and its programs and a sense of the fundraising effort.
Yeah, just quickly, the Sarasota Orchestra is the oldest continuing orchestra in the state of Florida, just slightly more than 7 decades old. We have 3 umbrella parts to ourselves. The orchestra, the Sarasota Orchestra, the largest part is a unionized regional orchestra. And then we have a very extensive education and outreach program. And then the third leg of our stool is the internationally highly regarded Sarasota Music Festival. So we have program activity in a typical year, essentially 10.5 to 11 months of the year. And we've been serving this community for, as I said, 7 decades. So this year was a little bit different because much of our typical activity from March 13th on was certainly impacted by the global pandemic.
So just to kind of round out the description, how many presentations is the orchestra making in a regular season? And how many students do you have engaged in the youth program?
Yeah, in a typical season, we do more than 125 performances in 5 or 6 different venues in the Sarasota-Manatee County region. And then our youth orchestra program has been servicing just slightly more than 300 students and 8 ensembles. And that program typically runs from September to April. Although this year, for the first time in our history, we have no fall youth orchestra activities.
Ouch. Well, hopefully better luck next year.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned in the beginning, you managed to surpass fundraising goals in the spring. And then you turned around and had a great success with fundraising in the fall. And I know from our work together that the Patron Experience has been a big piece of the way the orchestra kind of looks at the world, and I think likely of the fundraising success. So could you tell us a little bit about what you're meaning when you talk about the Patron Experience, and how does that focus affect the daily work of the development team?
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric. I think probably it's really wise to just maybe back up. About 7 or 8 years ago, we reimagined how we were going to go about doing development. We restructured our development team. I had read Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams, certainly a general and a military book, but it really had a lot of interesting ideas about how teams can work together and how they can provide the foundation for collaboration, in particular when things are more challenging or uncertain. So I never imagined when we started to build that sort of different approach, different philosophy in our development team, never quite imagined that we would need to call upon it in an environment quite like this. But the reality is A lot of that great work that we had done 7 and 8 years ago provides the foundation for what we do today, which is really putting the patron at the center of the experience. I know you talk to a lot of music directors or orchestra managers, and they say it's all about the music. The music is something that we produce, and we go about producing it at a very high level. But we sort of turned the paradigm a little bit to focus a little bit more on the patron as we reimagined our approach to all of this. And some of it actually was born when we did our rebranding effort back in 2008. And one of the things that we talked a lot about in branding, most people think about branding as something that you project to the outside about who you are. But if you really think about branding in its real core sense, your branding evolves from your patrons, what lies in their hearts and emotions about you. So we became very patron-centric with how we interacted with patron, how we nurtured patrons. And of course, in all of us that work in philanthropy and advancement development know that, that cycle of cultivation and stewardship and solicitation, we really put a heavy focus on stewardship with the full belief that if we were stewarding really well and building deeper, more emotional connections to donors at all levels, that we were in all likelihood probably going to be more successful with individual donors, corporate donors, and over time, that's exactly what's happened. We have built a really, really phenomenal connection that's built around trust and built around excellence and built around the patron, and that has really led to this platform, which enabled us to raise the money that we needed to finish the last season after canceling 36 concerts and create the foundation to ask for leadership, major gift, philanthropic support to sort of launch and execute this Reimagined season. So it really goes back, this culture and paradigm shift goes back, 7 or 8 years ago. And, we work on it every day and every year. And that's really what's been the foundation to help us during this period.
Can you give us just a little sense of numerically what we're talking about when we say we were able to reach last season's goal, and how much money you were able to bring together to mount this Reimagined season?
Yeah, so typically, going back 4 or 5 years, as we've grown both our number of donors and our imprint, we were raising philanthropically slightly less than $4 million a year. And that grew over the last 3 or 4 years. And, this year we exceeded those goals, well ahead of 5 million. And we set a goal to raise more than we've ever raised philanthropically for this coming season, because of course there's virtually no ticket revenue. We have a Reimagined season where in a typical year we would perform for about 65,000 patrons in a live setting. This year, amongst our Reimagined socially distanced programs, that's going to be about 2,600 will experience us live versus close to 65,000. So we developed a streaming platform, and our first stream concerts will be available later this week. And we have 13 alternative programs. But from a philanthropic standpoint, to produce this Reimagined season with virtually no ticket revenue, it was going to really rely upon our relationships, the trust we had built with leadership donors, major givers, donors of all levels, to help us support the season. So we're well on course, I believe, to raise more than the 4.5 million that we sought to seek from individual gifts this year. I imagine that when this fiscal year, which just started for us on August 1st, I imagine when it finishes up, we'll be well ahead of that goal, which is really important because as we begin to move through this period, or continue to move through this period, we were guided. We had discussions probably within 5 to 8 days when the pandemic set in back in March, that I told our senior team that I wanted them to really be thinking more about recovery. What things did we need to do to make sure that we could recover from this in as strong a position as we can? So that's really been the foundation for driving this real focus on major gift philanthropy to get us positioned for what we're all hoping for will be a normal, typical 21-22 season. But there's a lot of road between now and then. The good thing is our staff and our musicians, as a result of these changes we made in development and becoming more patron-centric, we've really approached everything with a great sense of innovation and inventing our way forward. And that's been a really important part of the whole plan.
Something must be working given the way donors are responding to help you make an as yet unknown season come to reality in the way they have. I just want to come back to this idea of patron experience a little bit longer, because surely that's not just the responsibility of the development team.
Yeah, that's a really great point. When we started this work, it became clear, I mean, many organizations that are a smaller scale and have a small development team, how can you really get a broader impact with a small team? So everybody that works here at the orchestra is involved in advancement in some form or fashion. And it goes back to that premise that a lot of advancement work is stewardship work. And most everybody can feel good about, hopefully, the organization they work for and telling the story. So our musicians, all the musicians in the orchestra, all of our staff, our board members, they play an active role in this advancement tapestry here at the orchestra. So, for example, our board members last spring, it was probably early May, there was a campaign here. It's a community campaign where several of the foundations locally offer a program called the Giving Challenge. And many of our people, made gifts to that, and they were matched by the foundation. But really phenomenal was we'd received about 400 and some odd gifts from that particular campaign. And our board members actually each divvied up the list of people that had made gifts during that campaign and called donors to thank them for their contribution. So 400 calls were made, more than 400 calls were made to patrons, donors from board members. And that led to this deeper engagement between board members and a patron about their experience. We learned some deeper things from them, but all of those patrons were really touched. And another thing that we had done as our musicians, as soon as we announced that we were postponing our previously planned season this year, we had asked patrons to consider converting their subscription into a gift to support, this reimagined season. So numerous people did that too, and we made sure that within 2 to 3 weeks of that patron making that decision, they got a personal note from a member of the orchestra thanking them for believing in the Sarasota Orchestra and making it possible for the music to continue, albeit in a different kind of way. So these are the kinds of things that go to that patron experience, Eric, that really nurture and inspire patrons to remain emotionally connected to us in a significant way. And just this Saturday night, actually, this was our first weekend of Reimagined programs. So we had an audience of 46 socially distanced patrons with 13 musicians playing. And I think the thing that made my evening sort of most memorable, the orchestra the musicians were fabulous, as to be expected, but a patron came in that I hadn't seen since probably back in February, and her husband had passed away not too much prior to that. And she walked in and shared with me how happy she was to get a note from a musician. And she took it out of her purse and, shared it with myself and another member of the donor engagement team. And that's an example of this strong, deep emotional connection that radiates from the brand. So when I see patrons, or in particular donors, having that kind of experience, it tells me that the brand of the Sarasota Orchestra is vibrating at a very high level, because it's those patrons, those donors, they're the ones that actually establish the brand, because they create that emotional energy behind their experience. So those are just a few examples of how committed we are. And the donor engagement team, the 7, 8 of them along with me, other members of the senior team, board members, musicians. So our development team here, if you take all of the full-time staff, musicians, and board, our development staff is, probably numbers up to close to, 150 people.
And every one of them well needed and well deployed, clearly.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that's really, when a lot of times organizations think about we have to ask people for money, most people don't like to ask people for money. But when we rebuilt this culture at the orchestra, we said, we have people that can ask people for money. We want you to help us being good stewards, telling the story, showing your dedication, showing your human warmth. So, when you come to a Sarasota Orchestra performance or a program event, what you find is a highly humanized, personalized experience. And, the great thing about that is patrons and donors do talk to each other. So, if we do our work well, the patrons themselves become an extension of our development effort. And I recall a few years ago when it was the first concert of the season, and we had provided a stewardship note. I remember it from a harp player, happened to be the one that wrote the note. Patron received it at a performance, and it was so interesting to me. The patron actually took a picture of the note on their phone because they were so touched to have gotten a note from a principal player in the orchestra, and then transmitted that note on their social media. So it went to all of their network of friends. So there's an underlying example of a good use of social media, and if it's done with good intention, phenomenal things can happen from that. So that became, amongst that donor and their friends, wow, that was really incredible. A musician wrote, and then people started to be like, this is an organization that I want to be around.
So you have this great focus on patron experience, a good team of development professionals there in your donor relations group. Tell us a little bit about some of the changes you've had to negotiate as a result of the pandemic, and what has that meant for the orchestra?
Yeah, it's I think the first thing, we played our last concert on March 12th. It was a Masterworks weekend here. Keith Lockhart was the guest conductor for what would have been 4 performances. Jeremy Denk was here playing a Beethoven concerto. So we did one concert on the Thursday night, and then the next morning, we started the process of postponing. In parallel with that, one of the first things that I focused on was to make sure that our donor engagement platform was able to convert as fast as possible to a virtual platform. I thought a lot about all the work that we've done over the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And I thought, it's really critical that we figure out a way to remain connected to our leadership patrons and all of our patrons. So the donor engagement team, at that point, we were still in the building, sort of people were here working. So we had some meetings, and then we quickly, within a week, we're all working off of a Zoom platform. We ended up meeting daily, and we began to reimagine all the things that we needed to do. And that really worked out really quite well, because within 2 weeks, we were on the platform, it was working. And then with each successive week after that, the chemistry of the team and the effectiveness of the changes became even more successful. So, one of the things that we did early on in partnership with our chief operating officer was to create this platform called Music Moves Us. All of our musicians were at home, so our operations officer said, why don't we try to get our musicians to create little musical vignettes, tell a little story, play a little bit. So we had probably 35 to 40 of those vignettes, and we would sort of put them on our website and release them every couple of days. And that was a way to remain connected. And going back to that emotional personalization, our patrons were beginning to learn and discover things about our musicians in a completely different kind of way than they would at a typical performance, because the musicians had made these vignettes in their home, and had a little storytelling. I recall one of our cellists that had gone to New York City, and he created his vignette from there because his sister was a nurse at one of the major New York hospitals, and he was there to look after his niece and nephew while his sister was providing, critical medical support. So this whole notion of our patrons began to see our musicians in an even more diverse, rich context. And that was a great thing that helped us to raise, significant revenue to support the season that was, ultimately ended up in canceling 36 performances. So that was a really, really powerful sort of tool. And as that was going along, members of the donor engagement team began to do Zoom calls with individual donors, checking in on them, seeing how they were doing, if they needed anything. And then we probably about June began to integrate a donor engagement team member with a musician on the call. So a musician would join the donor engagement team member. And then in some cases at the end of their conversation, which might have only been 20 minutes or a half hour, musician might have offered a short little musical motif of something. So it was a way to stay connected and relevant. One of my favorite ones was actually our principal tubist, Aaron Tyndall. He has a studio at home that most donors would never have the opportunity to see, and has all his tubas and all these kind of interesting things. And Aaron did some Zoom calls with our donor engagement, one of our donor engagement team members, where the donor came inside Aaron's studio and had a firsthand experience of his studio in a way that they would never have had we not had the pandemic. So we all want to get back to normal, but we found a way to innovate our way forward and reimagine our way to a future that is as vibrant today as it was before the pandemic set in. So there's still a lot to be done, and we're working on it all the time. Another project that we had done was with our leadership level donors, the picture of the orchestra, which I think some of the folks on the call today here have seen. We turned that into a puzzle. So, in the middle of the summer, when everything was the way it was, our leadership donors got a picture of the orchestra in puzzle form. And, that was another way to sort of stay connected, and a reminder to all of us that the success of the Sarasota Orchestra is the result of all of these individual pieces coming together as a whole. And that has really been sort of the cornerstone of our philosophy and approach to all of our work.
So clearly a place where innovation is present day to day and week to week. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you're envisioning for this reimagined season, and a little bit more about how the development effort has made that possible.
Well, none of it would have been possible without the donor engagement team, without the board, without the musicians. So everyone really, pulled together to make it possible for us to have these conversations. But innovation is a big part of our entire overall plan. And one of the things that I have found during the pandemic is, whether it's a sports team that's an underdog or an orchestra in the midst of a pandemic, people really want to root for a group, a team, a group of people that are trying to overcome something that's pretty challenging. So as we began to imagine the new season, we knew we wanted to have some programs inside, although socially distanced. Our string players are the only ones doing the early season programs because they can wear masks. So that was one piece of it, and our donors could be excited that, wow, this is a way we're going to still be able to get music. And then, we had some donors that were really committed to, they appreciated our resilience and our innovation, that they said, well, if we want to help create a streaming platform. So for those people that are not comfortable coming to a concert in person, and, the seats are so limited because of social distancing. So we had some donors step forward that helped, supply the resources we needed to create, our virtual concerts. And, we've done a really good job on that, and, we'll continue to refine that. So those are examples. Later next week, we're going to announce a series of outdoor concerts that are small performances that will use our brass quintet and wind quintet. We will not use them indoors, the brass and winds, because of aerosol purposes, but this was a perfect way to imagine an outdoor opportunity to still remain connected and engaged. So it's the combination of all of these things that I think has been the secret sauce that has inspired donors to stay with us and to help us, get over this period. So I do think, Eric, it's really difficult if your organization is not imaginative, innovative, has an aptitude and a courage for smart risk, it's really hard to dial up all of those things if they haven't existed before you needed them.
Yeah.
So the success of the Sarasota Orchestra is largely rooted in work that we did 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 2 years ago, all of those things that gave us this entrepreneurial, innovative, resilience kind of mentality, smart risk orientation. That's been sort of the engine that has moved us through this, and which has been the inspiration for donors to stay connected and engaged.
So I think that a lot of people listening to this conversation are similarly in organizations where they are surrounded by creative people and where innovation is more of a possibility than perhaps at others. I'm curious if you just take a moment as the senior manager there at the Sarasota Orchestra, the leader of the pack. What kinds of things do you need to think about to do, encourage, promote, enhance, inspire innovation?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do, which I believe we've done with our staff, musicians, and board, is to create a culture of inquiry within the organization where people feel comfortable being curious, and to promote an environment where people are encouraged to share. I think when you have that kind of an environment, people are naturally more comfortable. They know it's part of the DNA of the organization that this is how we operate. But I'd also say that, part of the trick, because a lot of times people say, like, we got so many good ideas. The ideas have to be strategically organized, not unlike a piece of great music. It has to come together strategically and make sense, from a harmonic and a rhythmic standpoint and a pacing standpoint. So, we and the senior team here really spend a lot of time staying true to the culture of inquiry and innovation, and then disciplining ourselves to make sure that when we're saying no to a particular idea, it might be a great idea, but it might not be strategically aligned with where we are at a given time. A real good example that we just launched, so we have this Books and Note Club that our artistic advisor, Jeffrey Kahane, and our musicians collaborated on. We had wanted to kind of get that going back in like May and June and July, and for a whole range of reasons, because we were postponing one season and inventing another. Well, it turns out it was a great idea and had to kind of go through and a process. And, we just launched it in our newsletter just literally about 10 days ago. And, the Books of Note and recommended reading is landing at a perfect time for our patrons, recommendations from musicians, and a series that Jeffrey will host. And that's kind of coming to this time again. So that goes to like a pacing question. So, we welcome all ideas, and then it's having the discipline to sequence them in a strategic way for maximum effect.
Which is a great launching point for my last question for you today, which is to see if you can look into the future a little bit as someone who is driving innovation and accustomed with innovation or to innovation. What are we learning from the challenges of the pandemic? What are the things you think that we have learned that are going to stick with us for a good while? And what advice do you have for people listening about, kind of adapting and changing as we move forward in unprecedented times?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the new normal. I don't know that I subscribe to the new normal because, for so long here, we've been practicing, this concept of this culture of inquiry and innovation and stewardship, and vibrancy of vision. So I think for us, it means just make sure we keep doing those things. Because, there might be a new normal in 6 months or how many new normals can there be? So what we've tried to do is really create these core characteristics within the organization that, create our ethos for how we operate and interact with each other. I actually think that's our best attribute to navigating the period forward. And I think I remember back to our rebranding when we changed our name from the Florida West Coast Symphony to the Sarasota Orchestra, how scary that was at the time. And I think change is going to happen anyway. So ultimately, we get to decide whether we're going to help author it or be defined by it. And we have a bedrock principle here that change is going to continue to rage. And we just make sure through this culture and this ethos that we practice, we're making sure that we have a seat at the table of change, so that we can architect it for our own vibrant future. So, that's it. I think it's just doing that work every day, not backing off, leaning into it all the time. And I was really proud of the orchestra this weekend and the staff. I mean, I don't know in our history that we ever have gone 7 months without a concert, from the last one we did on March 12th to the one we did this past Thursday night. But I mean, that incredible sense of resiliency on the part of our folks.
I know it was a full house because it was a small house, and I hope it was very well received.
Yeah, it was super well received. I do have to share a chuckle. I never imagined driving home after a performance celebrating 46 people came. But it was a really phenomenal evening, and the musicians were exquisite. And now, that's right as we speak is being edited and converted into the first stream concert. So for $10 starting, later this week, anybody here in Sarasota, or for that matter, anywhere. I mean, we might have some people experiencing the Sarasota Orchestra later this week who might be in other cities in the US, and we've never done that before. So that's really fantastic.
You've gone this far. For $10, what's the URL?
SarasotaOrchestra.org, and all the information is that you'll need is there. And you can call any one of us, musician, staff, board member. We're going to bring this level of patron-centric experience to you and everyone that we play for and meet.
I am sure you're going to get a lot of traction on the presentation, not only the live ones, but the recorded ones. And I really want to thank you for sharing your experience and your insights today, Joe. It's really great to talk to you always. And thank everyone for joining us today. A recording not only of the orchestra available at sarasotaorchestra.org, but also a recording of this webinar will be available on the GGNA website. Answers to your questions will be available as well. And you'll find many additional resources from our webinar series on fundraising during the time of COVID-19. So thank you all very much, and have a good rest of your day.